I can't make it louder. Eric's got power. Sure. There you go. Probably not could get a lot of traffic in the back. Probably not. Can you hear? Okay. Oh, we'll be okay, I think. And we can see them. Yeah, on the side. Where'd you park? Right behind us. We guessed. Let's talk about Eusebius for a moment, and I want to enter tonight's discussion. Eusebius was the first church historian who wrote legitimately under the Roman guise. He was a friend of Constantine. He wanted to write Constantine's life story. He was in footlock step with Constantine's policies. This was the first time you had an insider within the government who could access tradition. And who better than Constantine and his mother? Because I bet, and correct me if you think this is an exaggeration, 85% of all the traditions all came from Constantine's mother? Oh, yeah. Easily, because she would just make stuff up. I heard Peter Studer build a church. Right. And it was all oral tradition, all local tradition. I found Mark's part of it, but the other part's in Spain. So let's build sister churches, which is the kind of stuff they did all the time. And she didn't have to rob the government to do so. He ordered it as such. Constantine just said, you will lift that up and bring it here and build a church on it. So can we agree anything after Eusebius isn't legitimate history? Isn't. How would you know? Eusebius wrote 10 volumes on church history. I would say that's pushing it to say Eusebius belongs to it, but he admits that this is what he was told. He admits this is what the document said. And one more track back. From where did Eusebius get 90% of his information? Maybe 95. Where did he get it? It wasn't oral at all. Pamphilus' library. In fact, that was Eusebius' adopted name, was Eusebius Pamphilus. He took his name as his mentor. And that was the large 25,000 volume Christian library that was in Caesarea, from where Eusebius came as bishop. And with all that authority, he was given through Constantine the ability to write down what was in that library. This was the largest Christian library of the ancient world, and it lasted to the 5th century, until Islam moved its troops in. So this is very old, and 2,000 works on Origen alone, because he was a fan of Origen, but every imaginable text he could find, he got his hands on. Plus, he had catalogs of what other libraries possessed. And so he had original copies of things, one-of-a-kind things, and it lasted for several centuries. But Pamphilus' library was the standard for all such data. And if Eusebius is the one who writes down what Pamphilus found, then that seems okay to me. But Pamphilus dies, 2 years into the last major persecution. He dies as a martyr. After that, no one's there to interpret. And he was a scholar. He was a fine scholar. And Eusebius wasn't as good a scholar, but he did have that data. So I use Eusebius a lot because he'll tell me his sources. Clement of Alexandria said. So let's go there now. Who would you believe? Constantine's personal historian, Josephus, who was writing a very tainted Jewish history, or someone like Clement of Alexandria, whom we knew nothing about if it weren't for Eusebius telling us he existed. He didn't even write his work for the rank and file Christian. Clement of Alexandria wrote for the erudite philosopher in Alexandria to convince them that Christianity was an excellent philosophy. He wasn't even writing to the rank and file person. So you're going to believe who? Eusebius, Pamphilus, Clement of Alexandria? Or do you say, what did Origen say about what Clement said in Alexandria? Or do you say, Pamphilus is from Caesarea, what does the Church of Caesarea say? Or do you say, this is what Rome says? Or do you end up with a fragmented view of Christian history? For example, you can tell me that there's a Church of Rome in the first century, and I'll tell you there wasn't a Church of Rome in the first century, period. They're all underground. They're all underground. And we don't know how many Christians were there, but if the number of bodies in the catacombs gives us a hint, thousands of people lost their lives. They were so many Christians that the network of agents required to gather up Christians was full-time. And when you want a good fodder, when you wanted a big leader of the church to pay the price of martyrdom for just being aware of Christ, you bring in people like Ignatius, who wrote 7 documents on his way to being fed to the lions in order to tell his story. Don't stop me, don't stop me, don't stop me. I've lived a good long life. My death will speak louder than my words. So do you trust him because he's seeking it, or do you trust those who are trying to avoid it? Or does that sound like good policy? It's really difficult to look at the first 3 centuries and say with confidence, this happened, except for the New Testament. And then you got to question the synoptic tradition, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the 4th Gospel, John, who don't agree. Like the Gospel of John undoubtedly says Jesus had a 3-year ministry. Matthew, Mark, and Luke undoubtedly said it was a 1-year ministry. It can only be one. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were very simple texts written for the most part for Jews. John was written to Stoics, to non-Jews. He uses brilliant language. When someone gets really angry and tells me, no, I'm certain that John was written by an apostle, when did he go back to school? When did he become a Stoic philosopher? It would require him to leave the ministry for 20 years to become a Stoic philosopher to write the book. And even then, the form we have of it isn't authentic, because at the very end, there's 3 appendices written saying, in this one I have corrected the following. So we know that there were corrections made, but we don't have the parts that are missing to fill them in. So we only have an incomplete gospel which doesn't agree with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and that poses a problem of identity for many Christians, because our traditions are based on what? And I want to start with that this evening. I think if I were to write a church history as thoroughly as possible for the first 300 years, which is the only part that interests me anyway, you would have to start with the Gospel of Mark. I think Mark's gospel is the most honest. It's the one that had broke the ice. He opened the doors. He acknowledged the Gentile interest. He wrote on behalf of Peter, but Paul's language is still there because he traveled with Peter for 10 years and Paul for about 8 to 10 years. His uncle was Barnabas, the most well-tested non-apostle there was. He had sanction from the church of Jerusalem and Antioch. He traveled with absolute full access. Peter is illiterate, so you got Peter's testimony in this work because Mark wants to write it down. I think you start with Mark. Now, is that safe? Well, Luke begins his by saying, I'm the first to write an accurate account. The first 4 verses says, I wrote a first accurate account of Jesus' life. And then he wrote the book of Acts. And I'm telling you my feeling that the book of Acts was only written because of Paul's theology. Because of Paul's theology. Paul believed the end of the world was coming. There's no doubt in his mind the end of the world was coming. You would have thought so too if you lived under Nero, right? The treatment of Christians and the number of prisoners and those that are just wholesale murdered in the arena for fun, you would think the end of the world was coming. Paul was twice acquitted in prison. The first time, I'm sure he just waved out his citizenship card and he got released. Second time, he goes to trial. He's got all his paperwork ready. He goes in there, and the eyewitness accounts that he had all lined up, chickened out and left. And he still was acquitted. Paul, as you'll find in this week's reading, was anything but an orator. He was clumsy and awkward and childlike in his language. He could write beautifully, but he could not speak well. He was seen as almost illiterate in person, even though in writing he was brilliant. But you give it time, and the Acts chapter 15 emerges, and the council in Jerusalem convened, and now Gentiles can enter into the fray. The whole notion of Jesus coming back immediately has to stop. And I think if you look at the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is coming back real soon. Look at the ending there. Those of you standing here will see me return. But then you go to the book of Acts, the next couple of years, the Gentiles are now emerging, huge numbers. Jerusalem is now declaring independence against Rome. You know there's an impending war about to fall. And you end up with, sorry, go back. Are we on? Hello? There we go. I'll just turn off and on. At the very end, you can see it deeply puzzles Paul, what do we do with the Gentiles? And let's face it, there are a whole lot more Gentiles than there were Jews. And Paul changes his mind. The end of the world's not coming. And that's the only reason, in my mind, that Luke wrote Acts, to incorporate this new understanding that he isn't coming back tomorrow like we thought. It isn't going to be this generation that saw him die. That's not going to happen. The message to the Gentiles must be delivered. And that's why Acts is there. I'm convinced of it. Mark wouldn't have agreed with that. But Mark predates it. And whether or not Mark got all of his details right, he certainly used the right sources. And one of the sources was Paul, who wasn't an eyewitness to Jesus. So the animosity against Paul in early Christian literature is not just evident, but almost expected. He came from the finest school in the land. He came from a moderately wealthy family. He was trained in the best city of the world for his background. He was a Pharisee who studied oral tradition, never gave up being a Pharisee or oral tradition, but he couldn't speak. He was never going to be the spokesperson like his teacher, Gamaliel, who could, as my dad would say, charm the fuzz off a peach. You know? He had eloquence to him. Paul did not. He's never going to take that role on. And off to go get the rest of the Christians who fled from Jerusalem northward. When he encountered Jesus, you could almost hear it in the story. He says, "Me? You sure you got the right guy? I'm not so great with speech." Either was Moses. Remember his discussion with God? My verbiage and my vocabulary is weak. Send somebody else. So he says, I'll send your brother with you. He'll be the spokesperson. And yet he made quite a splash in the Jewish world, like Paul will. And Paul admits that he's weak in speech. He admits it 3 times in the scriptures. And one time to Galatians, he says, I know what you're thinking. That's actually 1 Corinthians. I know what you're thinking. How could someone write so eloquently but think so poorly? He writes so brilliantly, but he comes across as if he's an amateur. Never going to be polished. They're always going to come across a little bit ignorant sounding, like the apostles who came from Galilee, who were all fishermen or local business people, except Matthew, who all sound foolish because they had an accent that made them distinguished from the rest of the Jews northward. And these things are through all these texts, but we don't find them by the time we get to Eusebius. Christianity was a well-meaning political movement that brought religious elements in. That's what everyone wanted to believe, that the new empire, based upon the person of Christ, is what we've all been waiting for at the end of the world. Well, now it's been another 1,700 years since then. Where's the book of Acts now? Where's our book of Acts now? Like, I've taught at the university in religious studies now, especially in the Bible, since 91. And yeah, I have at least one more semester. They pleaded with me, and I had my retirement papers in hand. But I want to do it one more time. And here's the reason why. I can't figure out this generation. I can't figure it out. They have everything they want. They don't have to select what music they want. They just select the gender and the genre, and anything from that genre, it works for them. They don't have to believe in God, your God. They can believe in a God of their choosing or the God of their conspiring. I can build a little of this, and put it together in some sort of insidious slap at the church. And then 2 weeks ago, I read this article, and it was about millennials. And it was, "My millennials don't believe." And the answer wasn't given, but the process was. This was a psychologist for millennials. He gets them all the time. What do you think their number one complaint is?
Their complaint?
What's their complaint to a psychologist? You're talking about educated, well-intended, college-age millennials. It's the opposite. They panic over how many options they have. Too many. Can you imagine growing up in our generation? Having too many options? Well, think about it. What if I choose the wrong platform for my computer? I'll be laughed at. What if I buy a Samsung instead of an Apple? What's going to happen to me? They have too many options. So therefore, their God has to have that kind of option, has to have that kind of leadway. They don't want the God of Isaac Newton. They don't want the God of the Bible. They don't want the God of Shakespeare. They want their God, and no one's there talking to them. They think they get it from the mega churches, but what they're getting is a religious high off of music. They're not really getting a lot of teaching. 10 minutes from the pulpit telling you you're good and Jesus wants you to be rich is not exactly a message that's going to win souls, right? So if we can demythologize the New Testament and say Mark looks like the best source, by the time we get to Constantine, anything further added is going to be suspicious. You go to Pamphilus' library, those are all the sources you found. And you can begin to see how you can reconstruct the first 300 years with real data. What do you do today? It's all about science. But it can't be about science, because science doesn't answer your religion questions or your relationship questions or your option questions. It doesn't answer any of those questions. It answers, if I get into the wrong firm, I won't make as much money as my brother, but I want not as happy as my brother would be if I did. Those are the kind of options they're getting frustrated over. Too many options. Well, look at them. Too many options. They graduate and say, I want to do this, but my mom wants this, but my girlfriend wants this, but too many options. Where do we start with them? Do we start with them with the Big Bang, with anthropology and the origins of humanity? Do we begin with modern history and the Industrial Revolution and what that did to the Western world and the freedoms that it ultimately granted? Do we begin with the Peace Age, where we start looking at marches and banners and ideology being challenged for the first time, or the women's suffrage movement for 100 years? Do we look there? Where do we start to reach this group of people who ignore all of that which I said because it's about them and their generation, not knowing on the backs of whom they're standing to accomplish something? So I want to go back for one more semester with the focus of, what do you really want? Because this generation is utterly lost. They don't like the Bible. They don't like the Jesus we've made. They love science as if science is the answer. And there are some things science can answer.
When you say they don't like the Bible, have they really ever delved into it? Or
They feel that delving into it is
the
something.
church has let people down and really not done?
Well, I think it's looking at your parents' religion, and that's not good enough. Hypocritical, because it says right here, you don't do this. Right, and what is this about Jesus dying on a cross and resurrecting from the dead? No one does a virgin birth, no one does, because they look at science. Instead of saying, what did they think about birth, or what did they think about death, or what was the world's opinion about resurrection, which was the majority of opinion, they don't want to know any of that. All they want to know is, does it agree with my perspective? And it's not arrogance, it's grasping onto something real that they can't find, because they're looking for it in all the wrong ways. They want something, for example, I've said it here and I've said it in classrooms 100 times. I don't want to serve a God I can figure out, period. If I can figure it out, it ain't God. It's just not God. But I don't want a God I can't figure out to the point where I have to say, I have to accept it on faith, because that's not going to work for me either. I have to have something there. You lose faith in people. You lose faith in policy. You lose faith in politics. You lose faith in culture. You lose faith in movements. You lose all those things you can lose faith in because they started. Look at music. Just speaking of music. Look at music. I'm a product of the 60s. We knew what music was in the 60s. It was our music. Protest against everything, you know. Music had black and white singers. I know. It didn't matter what age you came from, it didn't matter where you came from, as long as somebody gave you a contract for which you'll make no money. We weren't so smart about contracts, but we were great about music. Well, what happens? The 60s run out. The 70s begin. And suddenly, music takes another change. And all those things that we liked about the 60s music all went away permanently, entering into the disco era, which was now about me and parties and cocaine and having fun. And then when that got too silly, the grunge, well, actually the punk age came in, and about me and my ideology, and now I'm going to force it down your throat like our parents did in music that you don't want to hear, because it's the same policy all over again. But that ends. It ends into the wonderful 80s, where suddenly everything is good and kind and we need to be better for each other and all. And then it ends up in all the sectarian cities. Washington has its sound, and Minnesota has its sound, and California has its sound, and now it's about this has been going on forever in all parts and walks of life. You can't start in the middle of something to expect the new generation of kids to get it. So where do you start? They're going to ask you about God. What do you think God is? What are the chances we're going to answer on their behalf?
Will you be asking that question, Brent? You think in the class?
I do.
How do you approach it?
I do answer the question. I first ask them, why do you need a God? Why bother? You say you're a scientist. Why bother? Why do you care? Why are you even in this class? This is a class, let's say, I teach 2 sections this semester called Bible, History, and Literature. You know what you're getting coming into it, right? So, where do you start? Because they're not going to start the conversation. They don't even want to talk about it in class. And yet it's a class on the Bible. When do you start? What would you think? Where would you start? They've been taught evolution. They've been taught all the sciences, especially astrophysics, where the universe has been explained. They read every book on ethics there is. Where would you start? And so I asked them in class, what do you want God to be? What's a God you would serve? Well, I want him. Why does it have to be a him? Well, I want it. Why does it have to be an it? You've got 2 words into this already, and I'm disagreeing with you. You're telling me it's a substance. You're telling me if it's a substance, if it's something that you can quantify, then you've already lost me, because I'm not willing to say God is part of his material creation. If God is what he made, then there is no God. So why don't you come back next week and tell me what your next phrase is going to be. Start with, I'll gladly talk to you about this discussion, but it's going to have to be on my terms, which is I'm going to use your terms against you. You cannot say it's you and your God. You do not have a God. You're still searching for him because you're afraid of death, and that's the only thing you're afraid of. And so I know that. The only thing they're afraid of is not being the name they thought they could be, because there's too many options. And so it takes almost 16 weeks for them to come to conclusions, because that's how long the class is, on how to define God and how to define God within historical consequence. For example, I have no problem looking at Genesis chapters 1 through 3. None whatsoever. Because they weren't scientists. This is how they understood the world to exist. That's all I would want. I do this. I'll say, you snotty-nosed little kid, right to his face. Why? Pull it out. Let me see you pull it out. He pulls out his phone. I'll say, everything you want to know is on this thing. Everything you'd want to know. How long has that been here? How long has that been here so you can have every piece of ID, every sort of Wikipedia's on this? How many years have you had this? 8 years. So you mean to tell me nothing was known before the last 8 years? I say, let me tell you how wrong you are. My child, I have a young child, my child will not be able to fulfill the jobs when he's 18 because they don't exist yet. 60% of the jobs that be hired when he's 18 don't exist yet. And I said, I know I don't want to quote a source you don't like, but let's look at the TV guide. Let's look at the TV guide. High-end writing here. They asked inventionists and creators and copywriters, what are the 50 most important products of the last 100 years? What do you think the number one was? Didn't exist yet. This was done in 2007. So we didn't know the splash this was going to make. It was still a flop up, nothing but the phone, like a cell phone from home, walking to the neighbors. They had no idea what we're going to do here. So what do you think the first, number one on the list is? This was back in 2007. I did it on purpose because this wasn't factored in. 2007. What do you think number one on 2007 is? No, but Telegram's good. It was on there, but no one uses them. So in the last 50 years, we've gone. But that's what the internet became. But the internet wasn't up yet in 2007. It was just daunting. 2007. 1907. I'm talking about 2007 like in. No. 2007. Yeah, 2007. Number one, the Walkman. The Walkman. Now, how far off were they 30 years later? That's what this is it not? It's a way to hold your stuff. Everyone has this for the music. The next generation, the CDs are gone. They're all being replaced by downloaded music, which means Walkman. The idea that you can carry your tunes wherever you want without listening to what's going on, that's a pretty good invention, the Walkman. Followed by the iTunes platform, followed by the integration of other systems, until finally Apple, this $1 trillion empire, able to create one for $100 or for $1,000 every 6 months. Now, you mean to tell me in 8 years' time, you're so smart? What's going to happen 20 years from now? I said, my brother worked for the NSA, which he does. He took me inside a building this size. There were 2 huge structures from like the wall to the mid-window and one behind with just air passage going through. He said, these are the first 2 supercomputers ever made. And this has 10,000 times more quality. And I told him this same antagonizer every week. So you think you got it all down. You think? What's good? Where is this going to be 8 years from now? Where are you going to be 8 years from now? You will have graduated and gone to a job that no longer has relevance the moment you graduate. Still think you're so smart? And you got God down, do you? You can't figure out your own life, but you've got God down. So you have to explain in a way that they understand, gotcha, without denigrating their approach. But to this idea that somehow, because you perceive of a God that X, Y, or Z makes it real, that's just not science any longer. You can't make those kinds of conjectures. God isn't what you want God to be. Look, there are a lot of things that have happened during my lifetime, or in your lifetime, that I wish didn't happen. Vietnam War I wish never happened. I just wish it didn't. I'm not sure what else we'd do, but I wish it didn't. My dad died in his 50s. I wish that didn't happen. We know why he died. It's unfortunate that he was involved with chemical. My dad was a golf pro, and he took care of all the landscaping as well. And no one knew that the big canisters of toxins that he was using were going to kill him, or he would have had him stop. But you used to see him in this cloud of red and blue and gold, and that's the light going through it of all these chemicals I was using on the grass. No one told him it'll kill you, and it killed him. He would have done it that way now, but now we know it kills you. I won't die of the same cancer because it killed my dad. That's how it works. So there's lots of things I wish didn't happen, but there's very few I could change along the way. So God's got to be greater than that. What if God isn't about things? God isn't about, like, if God is all loving and caring, which our Bible tells us, we do with human trafficking. Babies born with cancer. The tragedy of torment and terror from physical pain from birth on. Where's God then? Why doesn't God do something about North Korea? Is God incapable? Well, that's a question he's not going to ask, because he's not looking at a God that makes sense. He's looking at a God that he can formulate, that he can put in a Wikipedia page. That the gods around the world do these things. So I'm superior to that because I wrote the article. And I'm finding it more and more difficult to persuade this generation that God is not what you think he is, and is nowhere near what you want him to be. Like, my son, since I met you, I was married. And my wife went through some postpartum evil. And it took her personality away. And she left the family. Enough said. I've got a little baby. He's with me 24 hours a day, and I wouldn't have it any other way. He's almost 2. So he's the love of my life. He has helped me do more to understand God than any book I've ever read. You watch this little thing grow, and the relationship he has with the world around him, how simple things excite him. And then you see a commercial for human trafficking from Indonesia, and you look at your child and you think, girls are being abused at this age. Girls are being abused at this age. And your heart breaks. And you ask, where's God now? As soon as I can answer that question, I'll go back and answer his question. Where's the loving God that Jesus taught, who knows the numbers of the hairs on your head? Where's that God? And that's my job this semester, to try to put some closure to this debate, because I still meet with this guy. He calls me up every other week and says, okay, what about this approach? Instead of not getting it, you're not getting it. It's not about an approach. It's about answering, how could there be more than one God if God loves everybody? Look at the story of Lazarus and the rich man. The rich man was obligated by Jewish standards to help the poor man, but he didn't. He was a Jew. Didn't have to. He still gets to paradise. He just gets he goes through not a purgatory. It's like a purging process to get there. That's what you see in the parable. He's still going to be purged for it. His attitude has to change, but he's a Jew. He's made it. Well, Paul says the same thing in his epistles. You're a Jew. You've got the covenant. Whether you like it or not, Jesus died for you. Too bad for you, but Jesus died for you. That's a theology you can't interrupt. That's a theology you can't denounce, because you're in. Whether you like it or not, he died for you. I don't know if I can say that today. There's some people I don't know if God died for, in the sense of all those things that we believe about love and the relationship that God has with his people. I'm not sure I see that today. I'm not sure there's a place I can turn these students to say, that's the God I'm looking at. That's the person I want you to encounter, because I don't see it. I see it in the lives of individuals, but I don't see it in movements. I don't see it like I did in the 60s, where we're so naive we thought the end of the world was coming and we were going to usher it in.
You don't think that they've had any experience that far to know Niebuhr's prayer, hardship is the pathway to peace? That it isn't, it's the hard things that we go through.
No, you're wrong. It's the greedy parents you have and those around you. That's what they would say. That it's not my fault that the wealthy people are corrupting the world. They're leaving too large of a footprint to recover now from the planet. That's the way so far, yeah. The green footprint has now been crushed by industry. And you see it in themes of movies, and music has the same theme. It's a very popular theme. But it's just not genuine. you think you got pollution problems? Go back 100 years and step down the streets of London. We've done a lot to change. I'm not saying we're great, but we've done a lot to change, and we're not willing to admit that. What we're willing to admit is that our generation got it wrong, or your generation got it wrong, and our generation will either address. So I don't know what we can do to bring, let's say, the message into on campus. She's a very outspoken lesbian scholar, and she absolutely thinks Paul's the greatest corrupter of the human. Name calling, and she mesmerized, polar of Paul. And she said, as her closing argument, maybe you got me on the Greek, maybe you got me that I have abandoned the faith because of X, Y, and Z. But you can't tell me that Paul isn't responsible for that caught on you. But I'll tell you what, with your approach, and we should probably be very public when I say this to make sure you understand this is what it sounds like to me. Too bad Muhammad didn't know what would happen when he wrote the Quran, or 9/11 wouldn't have taken place. Are you willing to admit that? No. Why? Why can't you admit that? It's the same thing you just said about Paul. Why can't you say that? Because they're afraid of Islam. No, you can't be afraid of Islam. It's a good, healthy religion. You've made that clear multiple times in your classroom. See? This cutting and pasting of God, this cutting and pasting of religion and its experience is so thoroughly integrated into our argument system that science can't even address the notion of God. There's no need for God. There's no need for God because you're still defining God in the old archaic way of looking at a physical entity that represents it all. Do you take it literally that God said Adam was? Or did you go, you don't think he knew where the tree was? You're taking them into this already existing combine of other things you've chopped up to see what kind of comes out on the other end. But they'll tell me you only can select science or religion. I say, you're wrong. And the reason you're wrong is you can't tell me one thing science has to do. You can't tell me one thing science can do. It can't change my perspective about women. It can't change my perspective about religion. It can't change anything. All it can do is tell me what will make my life last longer, or how that planet looks more closely. Because in 20 years from now, everything you tell me is wrong. I always tell them in class, when I was your age, the universe was stretching and stretching to the point that one day it will tear up and frizzle into nothing. Now it's collapsing, and one day it'll all be one big black hole to be burst into existence again. Which one's true? Both were. And they're all scientists. Because the one thing this whole argument lacks is there has to be something outside the physical realm to make life worth living. This is a glass. It's got water in it. If I drink this, I'll be quenched. That's not a scientific question. It's a physiological question. I will die without some, right? This technology, as brilliant as it is going to look archaic in 10 years. It'll all be done by voice or by chip. And you know what the next generation is going to be. You want to sell this for $2,000 instead of $1,000? No problem. Put a key finder on it. You'll never lose your keys again. And protect your car. Someone touches your keys and move it, you're alarmed right away. You just protected your house and your car on the same. All the technology's here. We just haven't released it at one time. They did, but you're going to steal this, but it's going to disarm the moment you steal because it knows the moment it moves.
But in 10 years, when these get embedded in his skin right here, more than what you've got there.
Or put it in your eyes. Because the Google glasses did that. They were already computerized. They were just too creepy. Huh? That was totally creepy. Stephen Colbert did a great, this is in his old show, did a great spoof on this. He brought the cameras into the room with 30 people using Google Glasses and asked the questions and put the camera right on them and said, do you mind if I use the cameras during this conversation? No, you're recording me, but that's not right. That's right. It's not right when it's to your privacy, but it's right when it's my privacy, right? Wrong. And this whole cycle of ignorance. But what we can say is this. Things in this universe are endowed with consciousness, right? Last week, and I don't like watching these because I just captivated by it. A bear lost her little cub, and you actually saw the bear sit down and sob. It breaks your heart. A mother elephant a couple weeks ago, same way, lost it in birth and just moans and cries over this baby. You can't tell me there's consciousness missing. Grass knows when it's planted to turn towards the sun. That's a consciousness. A tree knows how much you can give away before it's a story. There's consciousness in this world. Why aren't we pursuing what that is? Because at the core of that, you've got God. And they don't want that. They don't want to deal with that.
Speak of your students ever about Christ being in that, in everything.
No, because then I have to explain the resurrection and the virgin birth instead of explaining the worldview at the time of what brought life into the world. There's no backup to this class. If there were part two, I could get into the themes, but I just can't.
That love triangle between Father, Son.
Yeah, they don't want a Trinity either. Because that would, well, I'm not sure I want a Trinity the way we've created it. That they understand because they're parents with the love generation. They've missed it entirely. Love isn't a feeling, obviously. So these great lacks they have in their theology, if it's even that, is a quest to try to make sense of the consciousness that they're ignoring. They're conscious beings. And the only one question you really ask a conscious being is, are you going to be conscious forever? That's why heaven and hell become such prominent themes in modern day literature. The only question you want to know if you're a conscious person is, how long am I going to be conscious? And if you're suffering in pain and you're conscious, you want to know how long it's going to be before you die in consciousness. Or should I have injections so I'm incapable of feeling, but at the same time I'm also incapable of relationship? We're not answering those kinds of questions. We're not even addressing those kinds of questions. We're not even talking about those things in medical school. What's the right of a doctor over these things? How much honesty can a doctor really tell his patients? They really don't see the patients on that. They let the nurses deal with it. But we have to eventually come up to some idea of what consciousness is, and we haven't. You can tell me the world has been around X number of years and our primates have been through all this. Great. So we became more sentient beings. I got that. But now you're telling me there are no other sentient beings in the universe. That's what they're saying. 95% of all scientists say that we are the only sentient being. How can you tell me that? Blades of grass turn. You can't say that. But they have. Because they have to be like this generation, absolutely certain of everything until someone proves them wrong. I get people, and I am not kidding you, weekly who say, that's not what Wikipedia says. That's not what Wikipedia says. I said, go to Wikipedia and look up editors. Look at the average age of the editor and look at the average degree of these contributors. There's none. I saw an interview with a woman who's written 20,000 20,000 Wikipedia articles. Not even a sixth grade. She just uses encyclopedias and put them on. Well, who's to stop it? Nothing. There's no policing. You are. You go on and change something, and then you don't like what he changed, so you change it, and you don't like what he wrote, so you change it. It can go on changing. Anybody can be an editor. You don't have to be anybody to be an editor. They have 1 million editors. No problem with that. It's the content they have a problem with. Facts are eluding this generation in some ways, and yet they have more facts than they've ever before, right? I was watching this documentary of the 1940s and 50s and what they thought the automobile would be like in 2000. It's hilarious, just full of silliness. But to see how far off they are compared to what they have now, Some of those cars look very similar to what they thought 40 years ago cars would look like. Smaller, less gas, more parkability, the LEDs removed from the environment. You know why they put lead in cars, right? The only reason they put lead in gas is because you couldn't get the revving sound of those big old metal clunkers from non-leaded gas. So you put the gas in there, keeps the engine going, but also gets that sound. So you get those little fake cars that you see on the road, the brand new model of the Mach 4. It goes, sounds like a little cat. It has artificial sound. There's no guts to it. Those 50s cars, they were like moving houses. You needed that extra boost you use, despite its pollutive nature. They needed that extra bite to get the kind of speed and sound they wanted. Ask that anybody today. They won't tell you that. That's the history of the car. We've got a car that goes 60 miles per gallon. We've got one. We're not going to release it because all the cars that are out there would be immediately replaced. We're trying to relieve all of them from gas, remove all of them, so they are all electronic. Because now it's going to be a fight over electronics. Who owns the station? Who owns the electronics? Who owns the cars? Who owns the? It's never going to end. So like the music that changes every 15, 20 years, or the technology or the views about science, they change continually. So where do we start with this generation regarding God? Why do you need God? You've got it all figured out in Wikipedia. You don't have to have gender. All you have to do is wake up and say, I kind of feel kind of girlish today, but kind of guyish. I'll go by both today. Who thinks this is a good idea? I get to choose my gender today? They can have whatever they like, provided it doesn't hurt somebody else. And yet the environment, which is so important, you just polluted. So as long as it doesn't apply directly to me, it's okay with me. Again, where do you start with God? There has to be an evolution of God, or do we just start someplace cold and say, at this point, we realize the model that God was before the Industrial Revolution was wrong? Who's willing to start that way? 1900 years of this industry going down in no time at all? I mean, I asked a student in class last semester because I just got too much ego in the question that was asked. I have the rights I want to have. I said, do you? Do those rights mean that you should tout those rights to other people? Yeah, I have a right to tell people what I think. Tell that in Saudi Arabia. Your rights are gone, so's your life. You don't have a right. You have access. Use your rights properly. They don't want to hear that. They want to hear, I can do what I want to do. No, you can't. Because your mom isn't going to be paying those bills forever. It's just not going to happen. So you got to cut somehow. Someone's got to cut those ties. And this is the problem, is we don't know where to start with the God discussion. And so we go to all the gods. Let's first of all take the first 7 chapters and go through all the gods of the ancient and modern worlds. But you're not an expert in any of those. What makes your generalizations any better than mine? You still have to start someplace. You want to say the Judeo-Christian God? Well, that term's no longer used. It's been eradicated from the list of potential terms that aren't harmful. So where do you start? Do you start with the founding of this nation? No, we can't do that because we're a Christian nation. But that's the byline, isn't it? Of course it is. It was from my youth and is to this day. We just don't know which God. So where do we start? Seriously, I need some help on this. Where do we start? Like, you know Teddy. You know Teddy. He's a cute little kid. My Teddy. Hold on. Hold on, that's where I'm kind of going. So you know Teddy. Teddy's 21 months. He'll be, 2 in just a couple of months. I want to start praying with him at 2. Right? I'm going to get such pushback for this. I'm going to get tremendous pushback because a kid should decide for himself the religion of his. No!
They should decide for themselves a religion just like they should decide for themselves whether to brush their teeth.
It's abominable to me, this notion that all rights go to. My son knows a tone of voice. That means stop. Dead cold right now. That means stop. Between that and the play come. Come on. Come on. Should I pray with him? I think so. Why? Because prayer meant a lot to me as a kid. We moved every year. I didn't have friends. Prayer was like another buddy in the room, you know? Will he know what we're doing? Probably not, but he will have known it started. But I'm going to start on his second birthday. I'm not going to tell anybody. Because I don't want them coming back on me saying, well, so you believe God's a real thing? Yeah, I've never denied God a real thing. My problem is that you just call him a thing.
But you don't want him to remember the time that he began.
That's right. So you want to start early enough.
I would say start tonight.
I'm not sure. Well, okay. I'll look at it. I want to start at 2 because there's so much that you learn at 2.
Oh, yeah, but I
You
mean,
know.
choose a lullaby you normally.
Oh, no. Lullabies are fine and songs are fine. But I mean real prayer. I mean real prayer where reverence is there and it's emotion that he goes through and the physical God manifested, the sense of in my hands there's something that I'm focusing on, and in my mind I don't want him to turn into a meditator. I just want him to acknowledge that good things happen because of God and that bad things happen because of poor choices. I just don't know how far to push that. They believe in, like, my son and I didn't leave the house yesterday. Not once. He didn't want to. He has toys, not a lot, but he likes playing with them. He'd rather take a bath with Dad than go outside and play in the park. Even though we play in the park, we did live 2 blocks from it, so it's not that far away. But we didn't leave the house at all, and neither of us, it didn't acknowledge or didn't ring with any of us, either of us, that we hadn't left the house all day. And then you just saw that look at dinner, like we didn't leave today. And all he wanted to do is continue to play. So I want him to be that cognizant of prayer the same way, where this is something I've always done. It's a safe place I can always go. And I'm not sure he's going to pick that up at 2. He may, but we'll try. We'll try. 2 is a good age. 2 is that first watermark, You reached a place of importance in the quality of decision making. I don't know, but I'm going to do this and see what happens. My students would think I'm wrong because I'm choosing for him which God. The word God doesn't choose a God. The word God just emotes a response from what you think God is. I'm not imposing upon him any form of God. And by the way, I have the right to impose upon him any God I want if I so choose to do so, like you are now. So don't get in my face over something that you don't want your own kids. And here's the thing. They come to my office in private. I'll tell you the latest. We don't have office hours during the summer. So she said, can I come by and see you? And I said, sure. She's pregnant, and she doesn't have a husband, as a father for the child. And she's thinking of aborting the child. And my students know I'm quite outspoken on this issue, which is probably why she came to see me. And I said, and you want me to give you a reason to keep the baby? She said, I'm hoping you'll talk me out of keeping the baby. I said, you reached the wrong person, because I've seen my baby in the womb, and that's a real living thing. So if you can live with murder from the standpoint of ending a life, then at least be honest with it. But I'm not ready. You were ready to get pregnant. No one ever sat you down and said there's consequences if perchance something goes wrong? She said, how do I tell my parents? I said, that's an easier question. But you determining whether or not you want this baby is the paramount question. Because if you don't feel that you can be the best mom for this child, there are other alternatives. People who will take your child and give you access. But you need to make that determination now, because in a couple months, you're going to feel that thing kick. and it's going to be real to you, and you're going to have to make even a worse decision then. Make your decision now. And go talk to your mom and go talk to your dad. Talk to them separately. Don't talk to them together. Talk to your family and get their impressions of this and ask them if they're willing to be your village, because it's going to take one. You're not going to be able to do this on your own. You're pregnant and a senior. What are you going to do? And she started to cry. I said, there's no reason to cry. It's just your life suddenly changed, and you have to determine if this change is for good or for bad. And I'm telling you, you will never get over a baby you could have kept. You will get over a baby you didn't have a choice, but you will never get over that one. You'll always wonder. And I'm not trying to guilt you. It's not going to change our friendship. I would never tell a soul what you came to see me for. I'm just telling you, life begins somewhere. And for me, it begins in the womb. I said, this isn't a theological argument. This isn't a religious argument. This isn't a political argument. This is an argument of science. And here's the reason I know that. If you didn't want the baby, you call it tissue. If you want the baby, you call it baby. And parsing of words is not good enough for me theologically. And she started to cry. And I said, no reason to cry. And I told her my story. And she said, okay. I think I know my answer. So now I have to wait for school to start in a month because she's taken off. I hope she makes the right choice for her. Do we start there? This is where life begins. Where did life begin in Eden? Where does life begin in Christ? What's the difference between having to be forced out of paradise or be forced out of a womb, which is paradise, into the hard world in which we live to make decisions that can affect those? It's the same thing happened in the garden. They don't know they're naked, just like kids don't know they're naked. They clothe themselves only after they're busted, like a kid does. That's what's being said in that story. And it's the same story of the resurrection. You're not resurrected in flesh that people can see. You're resurrected in a body that's immortal, whatever that is. Whatever the apostles saw, that's what you see. I'm not sure what that is, but they didn't know that Jesus had left by the time the angel said he's already gone. They're still staring, waiting for him to come back. And so I'm not confident that we have a place to start yet. I'm not sure science is willing to talk about it. I know religion isn't willing to talk about it because they're too diverse. They're too diversified to the point where you can't get a Muslim and a Christian and a Jew in the same room talking about any of these issues. I wouldn't know which Christian to bring in anyway. Or for that matter, an American-raised Muslim. I wouldn't know if that's the person that to best represent their faith. But I also know that there's 50,000 Christian denominations around the world. I wouldn't know which one of them to ask either. 50,000. So I'm not sure that we're ready for it yet. If we can't even start with where do we begin, if we can't even have an origin to this discussion, I don't think we're ready for it. So what are we waiting for? What pieces are we waiting for? To gather up our understanding of other religions, to gather data we can for church history, to start with Eusebius and read backwards and say, this is what really happened. How did the apostles get it wrong about when Jesus was going to return? How did Paul get it right and no one agreed with him until so much time passed that it was obvious? At what point do you say, I was wrong? And how many Christians are willing to say that? They all can't be right. I had a student in my class last semester who believed in the Bible. He's about as much a bibliolatrist as I've ever seen. He also believed he had the right to mix verses together. A little of Matthew, a little of Numbers. I can put them all together in one big theology. And I said, you can't do that with your own. How would you like if I took all your term papers this semester and cut them up and repiece them the way I want them to be understood and resubmitted? You'd flunk every class. You can't do that with the Bible. You can't do that with other people's religious texts. You already have animosity toward the other person anyway. You're going to try to make your religion predominant, and that's not a healthy argument. So where do we start? I'm asking because I really want to help this semester. This is my last semester at the university. I really want to help solve this issue of where do we begin? It can't be Exodus and Genesis. It can't be the leaving of one territory for another. It can't be leaving the Garden of Eden or leaving Egypt. It can't be that. It can't be the Torah because the Torah no longer well, even the Torah among the Jews isn't completely followed. It can't be oral tradition because there's too much of that. So what do we wait for? What do we wait for? Henry, where do we start? Because you've been through this 1,000 times. If I were, if I were to, let's say, you need a blog, because the blog is answering everything. Who are you gonna police on the blog then? Who's gonna be the police person on the blog? So yeah, I think we're not ready for it. You know the technology is out there to deliver it. How do you keep it sane without it becoming a food fight or a bunch of trolls out there just trying to create havoc? We're living in a beautiful age technologically, but a horrible age with personality. We've got some really bad attitudes out there, and they're able to share all their ugliness with the world with a single click of a key. So do we start with books, literature, conversation, meetings, the internet? Where do you think we should start? Because I think you're right. I think you only are inspired when there's someone with you that can verify.
I think you can learn something from someone who's learned something.
Right.
That,
At least the methodology.
and that you feel that same, whatever it is, the spirit from the other person somehow corresponds to what's encouraging you to listen to them. And that somehow, there's like this aha moment. Yes, I understand that. That's what I feel myself, but I haven't thought of it before.
But how do we get more than you and me together around a table doing this without it being a blog? Without it being a blog. Because this is
Yeah, I mean, you
Because
continue
you
to
can
go
go
the
the
right
right
way. I mean, that just goes on and on.
well, yeah, but there's the internet now, your senses. But yet the conversation has to be introduced. Like, you know full well the disciples did not go to every nation. There's 12 of them. Right? There's 12 of them. So where do we go today? How do we reach them? How do we access any of this? Anybody? Because you can't go online, they'll troll you. That's all they'll do is post ugly stuff. They disagree with you.
You can show by example. We have a young woman in our church who halfway through her pregnancy, the would-be husband gave drugs and the church has been so supportive to her, and the baby's almost 2 years old now, and the baby gets handed from the first person in the service. Everybody watches, and she comes sometimes with me to Skyline, and it's a wonderful thing. She feels very comfortable in the church with that baby. And the other people, many of whom have to swallow hard at first, because realize that that to be a normal thing in Florida, this is example. The community and to the outside world.
I take Teddy to class. I don't take him in the class, but I teach enough classes where somebody has to watch him. And I don't want to bring him to class because it's too distracting. He just wants daddy, daddy, daddy. So there's young ladies that are teachers, so most of them are already teaching, and they're getting their post degree. So I hire them to come in for an hour and a half to watch them. And they were a great idea when I thought of them. But now you've got these young ladies fighting over each other who's going to watch him because he's so charming, right? But when the women on campus saw what I was doing, they decided to bring their kids to school. And now we have a problem. So in that church, one baby would be fine. 20 would stop the church cold. An average church would stop it cold. How many is too many? I don't know. But I can already see the chair going like this. You did something good, but I'm afraid it's going to backfire on you this semester.
We have in our church several gay
Wow.
and we adopted them with open arms. And,
It's just that
and they're racially mixed.
you live in a you go to a very open church.
I do.
Yeah. Your average church isn't like that. And they don't want to hear a baby crying, even off stage, let alone. Give them another room that's been soundproofed, and there's fans in the hallway, so no sound even gets out the doors, you know. Yeah, we don't want that. It's going to interrupt our rock and roll concert.
We had, a couple of weeks ago, this one 3-year-old had a meltdown during church, and her mom got her calmed down. At the end of the service, she realized she hadn't done anything yet. So while our new music director was playing his poster, she went and grabbed the children's cross and paraded it all around the church, so she had done something. Everybody says, "Okay, Brandy, we're glad you got your act together."
How funny. Most churches can't handle that. The first thing the bean counters would say is, "Oh, if that kid fell, the lawsuit would be awful." They go right to the law. It's the first thing to go is go through the law. Then they go through, is there precedent for this? Should we do this? And then it's what if everybody starts to do this? Are we going to start watching preschoolers too? And there's just no end to it. I wish there were a simple answer, and I'm not sure it's the church, because these people that I'm talking about aren't going to church. They've abandoned it. They'd love your church, but they're not going to attend it.
They love knowing that it's there.
Oh, yeah, but they're not going to do it. Yeah.
There are people who come in and say, "Well, that black kid, well, there's this mother, and she's white, okay. What about this Hispanic kid? Same mom." Okay, gee, look at the time.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand this. No, I just wish that there were an easy answer, and clearly there isn't. But I think Paul was struggling the same way. I think, I don't have it in the storyline, I'll end with this. In his narrative, I decided to leave the Stephen portion out. I've got the details there, but the psychological impact of Paul. I think Paul had an awful lot of struggle after Stephen. I think Paul had all those beatings and imprisonment and all the things he lists that he went through more than anybody else, knowing that he killed a believer, and Stephen of all people. I think he fought his whole ministry to bring him back. If you look at the longest sermon in the New Testament, it's Stephen's sermon, and the only person present is Paul. And he outlined the first 4 epistles of Paul, and they're almost identical to that sermon. I don't think Paul ever got over it. Is that where I start with Paul? Because wherever I start with Paul is where I got to start with Jesus. Is it after the fact? Is it after something's established? Or is it at the groundswell when something does begin? Where does it start? Do we have to get into the mind of Christ? Think of the last week of Jesus' life. Look at not just the pressure he's going through, but look at the psychological weight that's upon him. His best friend has abandoned him. The leader of the 12 apostles has betrayed him. His mother has doubted him from the foot of the cross. All this has happened at once, and they don't think he's going to resurrect from the dead like he said. The apostles are all in hiding. Peter's gone back to fishing. Is that where I should start? Or should I get us there first? I don't know. Does the blade of grass have to be planted before consciousness is there, or is it in the seed? I don't know. I just don't know. Does that have to be watered, or will it naturally happen? I don't know. I just know that there's no answer I've heard yet that makes me want to jump on board and say, me too.
Several hundred years ago, a saint said, preach the gospel, and if you must, use words.
Right.
Somehow, I think if you're trying to preach the gospel, if someone sees something in you, like one of my primary beliefs is that the Spirit of Christ, the Messiah, the Spirit of the Messiah is in everyone. That the Word of God can enlighten everyone. apparatus to something beyond that. And I think that's why, I just feel strongly about the whole focus of the Spirit of Christ being within us. If we're a true Christian and it's not there, we're not really a Christian yet.
Correct me if I'm wrong in the terminology, but there's a phrase at the very beginning of the unscientific postscript by Kierkegaard, where he says, the last Christian died on a cross. And all we can do from here is assume that to be true. He would, though, because he saw the failure of the church in the Lutheran church of his day, especially. He thought it was sold out. He saw the uselessness of this church archaic system. But when you say the last Christian died on a cross and all you can hope for is honesty, that's self-honesty. Boy, we don't find that easily. Somebody else has to help us. So do you recommend through books, through your new tape series, an iPhone?
There may be a book, there may be a person or persons, books, something, whatever it comes from. I mean, even if it's through suffering, you're in a concentration camp and somehow, you're going to die, but something comes to you to give you hope of something beyond what you're doing.
Isn't what, this is an overstatement, I'm sure, but isn't what most people really are after is an answer to what happens when you die? I mean, yeah. Why is there something? Right. Why something rather than nothing? I was at a conference where I was debating scientists, and I said, I'm on the wrong side of this. I'm really for science. But I'll sit here and find out why I'm against science. And their question was, science is proof, science is proof. First of all, science doesn't prove anything. Let's be real honest. Science is always wrong. It's always in the state of becoming more right. But it's always wrong. You have to assume it's wrong, or you wouldn't have science, right? It's always in a better state of rightness than it was before, but it requires certain individuals to get involved to make that happen. So it's never right. It's just more right than it was last time. And we're wrong half the time. Even though we're so certain of it, we're wrong half the time. And when you can show me, I don't know if you've seen this online, they take like a camera and go from one side of the universe all the way through the universe in about 3 minutes. It's astounding what they've seen. But you don't have it all. You only have glimmers of light that you'll be able to piece together from certain cloud structures of gases and such. But there has to be a place where you start. And is it starting with the assumption that something exists? We don't know what it is. We don't know how to define it, but it isn't what we've been told. Is that a clean enough place to start?
I think for a person who's intellectually, geared, or that's his tendency, that might be a place. But for others, it would just be, it's all materialistic. So I think it's an individual.
But you can't lead a movement through individuals. I just don't know where to start if I'm going to. If I'm about to start a blog again, and I don't want it all to be about facts. I want it to be about experience as well, and revelation that people have received, and the constant acknowledgement of that other that we're not able to explain.
I wish we had records of what the first apostles, like Paul, said and did when they were speaking to pagans, non-Jewish. We don't have much.
Yeah, the magistrates.
But they're just, ordinary folks on the street. I mean, here they believe in all these, gods and whatever. How do you get to them? How do you get them to really, what's the most important thing here? Maybe immortality, eternity. Again, the death issue. We all know we're going to die, even though we kind of maybe want to push that away because keep it as long as
Sure.
as possible, but it's still there. At the door.
Yeah, I think death is the place to start. And I think if I were writing a philosophy text, it would be, where your death is, whether it's what your death experiences have been till now, have led you to understand what death means in the future. Because that's all you can really say about death. You're going to die. You're going to die. Have you dealt with the consequences of that decision? And whom do you need to speak with real fast to make sure you're not letting somebody die who may have better insight than you?
But see, that might be a good point, I think, that we all know we're going to die. None of us know what's going to happen afterwards, unless, say, with the resurrection of Jesus, that certain people saw something, aha, there's actually something after death, really, but they couldn't, you could talk about it forever, but they saw something and knew something, they couldn't,
The wisest man who ever lived was asked, "Are you afraid of dying, Socrates?" He said, "No. Either it's moving from one place to another, or it is nothing." It's a good place to start. What did he say? Maybe we should start there. 20 people through history who you wouldn't have expected had a death experience or near-death experience or I chose death over experience, including some rather famous monks and others along the way who chose death over life. I would say the Apostle Paul certainly did.
There's something else I think that's completely missing today, and even in Christian America, is some, it's repeated a couple of times in the Bible, two, three times, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
Right.
I mean, again, how you understand that word fear, unfortunately, is what.
Unfortunately, the word fear is used at all.
I mean, it's this reverential awe.
Yeah, overwhelming sense of,
Smacking.
yeah.
And if you feel that in your smallness in comparison to your understanding of this source of all the universe and everything, time, space, you name it, maybe you need that kind of experience. But obviously, it does shape people.
It does. And it can shape someone whom you tell your experience. It's just not as effective. So let me play with that. Maybe that's the place I need to start. Because I don't want to leave this year, after all these years of teaching, and not have something I can start with for the same generation. Because I won't have the kind of contact with them that I do now. And they're bluntly honest with me of what bothers them about religion and the Bible and Jesus and God and all the things that they bring to the class. It's not normally like this on Thursday, but I've got a lot of things to ponder over the next couple of weeks, and I'm trying to sort out before the blog starts whom I'm really appealing to, who do I really want to attract. And so thanks for letting me air this out. The next document comes out on Thursday, as you know. It'll be a two-parter. It's a 36-page article, and it'll be on Paul, then it'll be on the epistles of Paul. So all month will be consumed with Paul.
For tonight, I really suggest that you start with the motion of this, but use some sort of a song as a prayer, like Jesus Tender Shepherd, which is my favorite, and I did it in German with my kids, which is a lovely evening prayer, and then you go into the spoken word, and you associate this beautiful centering music, and then this spoken word.
This week, what was it last week? Within the last 2 weeks, my son has a new word. He said, "Gi." Gi. And I thought, that's not a word. And all day long he said, "Gi, gi, 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 gi." It's not a word. I looked it up. It's not a word. I mean, it's a garment, but it's not a word. And he brings in his doggy. Doggy. He's talking about his doggy, his gi. First and last name, doggy. So all week long